I'd hasten to add it wasn't 15 seconds, it was 30 seconds, it was 15 minutes. And it didn't happen in China, it happened in Malaysia. And my wife-to-be was not Chinese, but of Indian descent, Indian Malaysian. So apart from a few inaccuracies, it was accurate. Now, I want to clarify, first of all, what this motion is about, or what it's not about is probably the best way of putting it. This is not a proposal that liberal Western-style democracy will always be inappropriate for China. I don't know what the situation is going to be like in 25 years or 50 years. I don't even know what the situation is likely to be in the West in that period. What we're discussing is something much more specific. Likewise, we're not suggesting, or certainly I'm not suggesting, and the motion is not suggesting, that what happens in China and the arrangements that are appropriate for China in this period should be transplanted into our own societies. I would not argue that for a moment. In fact, on the contrary, I would say that the reason Western democracies have grown up in the West has been because of the history and the culture of our societies. And we need to pay due respect, I would suggest, to China and the differences of its history and culture in the same way. What this motion is about is a country which is a developing country, which in the middle of the 20th century was extremely poor, which had suffered 200 years, during a 200-year period, of more or less, and I mean this literally, economic stagnation. Its GDP at the end of this period was more or less the same as it was in the first part of the 19th century. And it had been invaded and partially colonized by many countries, including our own. In 1949, China was a mess and a basket case. And the task that confronted China was how, with this vast country, could they transform it? And they made quite a few false moves and false starts. So when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, he identified the two crucial tasks of China. The first was an overwhelming focus on the need for economic growth, and secondly, intimately tied to that, was the need for a huge reduction in poverty in a poverty-stricken country. At that time in 1978, the Chinese economy was 1/20 of the size of the American economy. And since that move from the end of the 70s in the direction of economic reform, we have seen the most remarkable economic transformation in human history. A population of 1.3 billion people, 1/5 of humanity, its economy growing at 10% a year, to the point where, today, the Chinese economy is half the size of the American economy. And there's a general view now that the Chinese economy will overtake the American economy in size around about 2018. This is truly remarkable. And I want to correct you, Anson, because it's just not true that the British experience or the American experience of industrialization in any way compares with the Chinese achievement. The British Industrial Revolution between 1780 and 1830, which was the key period, or you can push it to 1840, the growth rate was around about, on average, 1.5% a year. 1.5% a year. And that was a population of, 20, 30 million at that time, probably more like 20 million at that time. Or take America. You mention America. Well, the period between the end of the Civil War, the mid-1860s, to 1914, the American growth rate never exceeded, on average, something like 3.5%. And that, of course, again, was a much smaller population. So that is why I suggest that this is the most remarkable economic transformation there has ever been. And it has been presided over by the Chinese government. And it has lifted, I mean, let's remember this as well. If you look at the reduction in global poverty over the last 30 years, China is responsible for the overwhelming bulk of that reduction in poverty. If you take China out of the equation, actually the global performance has been very disappointing. Now, I challenge the view that the Chinese government does not enjoy the support of overwhelming mass of Chinese people. I don't know, if you look at, for example, the Pew Global Attitude Surveys, the support for the Chinese government is extraordinarily impressive. If you look at Tony Sach's work from the Harvard Kennedy School in terms of the levels of satisfaction amongst the Chinese in terms of their government, the ratings are extremely high indeed. And is it so surprising? If your living standards are growing, as they have been now for a while, at roughly the same pace of economic growth, 10% a year, then, it's quite likely that your population is going to be rather pleased with government. And I challenge the idea also that, the political, of course, there are many things that are different from what we're used to, which we would certainly object to. But the idea that the sort of political atmosphere, the political environment is frozen is a mistake. I mean, the idea that, you said dissent is crushed. Excuse me, I mean, there are about 150,000 mass incidents every year in China in which people, which mainly consists of farmers objecting to what they regard to be the illicit seizure of their land by local government, flogging it off to property developers. And these actions are, they're reported in lots of places, and they take place, and it's not true that they're all suppressed. And sometimes when there is suppression, like in Wuhan, actually, the authorities are forced to retreat. Or take the wave of strikes in Guangdong province and along the eastern coast in Shanghai in 2010 and 2011. Tens and tens of thousands of people on strike. And they were not suppressed. They were allowed to happen. And the result? Huge wage increases. The minimum wage in Beijing was increased during that period by 30%, Shanghai roughly similar, and so on. Huge lift in living standard. So it's not good enough, to be frank, to paint China as this sort of autocracy with a central government which suppresses everything. There has been a huge shift in the personal freedoms of the average Chinese since the death of Mao. You've only got to go to Shanghai or to Guangzhou or to Chengdu and you can see it on the streets. And it's not true that everything is censored. Actually, the censorship in China is much lighter than it used to be, much lighter. And the access to information, sure, there are controls on the internet, but quite frankly, if you want to, you can get around them. So this is a society which is throbbing, actually, and it's vibrating with debate, contrary to the picture that Anson has presented, which is a very common picture presented to Western audiences. I wanted to just say something else. You see, my concentration in what I want to say is really about China as a developing country. Now, let's take a comparative example, India. In 1950, which has got, in many ways, a most impressive democracy, in 1950, the Chinese economy and the Indian economy were more or less the same size. Today, the Chinese economy is 4 times the size of the Indian economy. Why? Because the economic strategy pursued by the Chinese has been far more successful than the strategy which has been employed by India. And India has a great problem. It's got a most impressive democracy, which is what we celebrate, and an extremely corrupt and inefficient state which cannot deliver. In other words, in that sense, it's opposite to China. And the poverty reduction in China has been far, anyone who goes to China, goes to India can see this, has been far more successful than anything that has been achieved in India. Now, I think also we need a bit of humility about this. China is a huge, as Weiwei pointed out, a huge country on a scale that is unimaginable to us in the West. So its task has been it has been an industrial revolution, essentially. Economic takeoff, as Rostow described it. The shift from the countryside to industry. Around the time of Deng Xiaoping, it was not much more than 20% of the population lived in the urban centres. Today, it's 50%. Now, what was the situation politically, in the West, in Europe, in the United States, when we were having our industrial revolutions? How many Western countries were democracies at the time of their industrial revolutions? Shall I tell you how many? Zero. In Britain, in 1850, finally, 1/5 of men had the right to vote. That was after the conclusion of the Industrial Revolution. And it was not until the 1880s that most men had the vote, but not women. Or take America. It was not until 1860 that most white men gained the vote, but not blacks really until the 1960s, and women in 1920. And if you look at Europe, exactly the same pattern. Their industrial revolutions were accomplished essentially in France, in Germany, in Italy, and so on, before they had democracy. So when we say they should be like us, well, actually, we should speak with more modesty, because we weren't like what we want them to be during this particular historical phase. I would like to conclude by just saying this. First of all, I would ask my country to be more modest and more humble in the face of China's extraordinary achievement, and not think our task is to say, why the hell can't you be like us? But on the contrary, I think what we need with the rise of China is a much more humble attitude, which recognizes and respects their achievement, and also is willing to learn from them. And what we're going to face, I think, now, is not just feeling that democracy is important, but also we need to learn from the Chinese about state competence. This is not a subject that's been discussed in the West, but it will be discussed in the West. And here we have much to learn from the Chinese. Thank you very much.